Good afternoon. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see such a full house for what will be, I think, a terrific program this afternoon. My name is Stan Katz. I'm a faculty member here at the Woodrow Wilson School, and I first want to acknowledge the curator of the Bernstein Gallery, in which we have this wonderful show displayed, Kate Summers, who's standing back there. She's in charge of all the exhibitions we have here. Thank you, Kate. So I'm going to be very brief because I want to make the most of our time this afternoon. This is an extraordinary exhibition, and I'm not going to describe it for you. The speakers, I think, will mention it, at least Bonnie certainly will. Bonnie Kerness is going to speak first. She is she's had a really interesting history. She gave me a short bio. She got her start in an institution that I'm very fond of and once studied myself, the University Settlement House in New York City, which some of you may know. She was then very active in the civil rights movement, working with the NAACP, and she worked at the Highlander Center, which is an institution many of you will know of. So she worked in the South, she came back and worked in the North, got a Master's of Social Work at Rutgers University, and she serves now as the coordinator of the American Friends Service Committee's Prison Watch project. She's also an advisor to California Prison Focus, Women Who Never Give Up, and to other organizations involved in the problem of incarceration in the United States. She has contributed widely to a number of publications and programs of one sort or another, and she speaks widely in behalf of men, women, and children who are imprisoned in the United States and who are suffering human rights violations as defined by the various covenants of the United Nations. So Bonnie is an activist and has been a major player in the movement to do something about mass incarceration in this country. Second speaker is going to be Bruce Western. Bruce is currently the Daniel and Florence Guggenheim Professor of Criminal Justice Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. That's a position that he's had for the last few years, but he has been a professor of sociology at Harvard since 2007. Unfortunately, from my point of view, because he was one of my most valued colleagues here at Princeton, where he was a professor of sociology. He rose through the ranks, actually, starting in 1993 until he departed for Harvard in 2007. He's one of the leading sociologists in the country and certainly one of the leading writers, social science writers, on criminal justice policy. His most recent book was actually an edited collection called On the Great Recession, published by Russell Sage. His big book before that was called Punishment and Inequality in America. And his first book, which I think many of you will probably know, is called Between Class and Market, Post-War Unionization in the Capitalist Democracies. He's had a really interesting scholarly career. I'm going to mention now that there are two artists, of course, represented out in the gallery. One of them, luckily, is with us here today, Ojore Lutalo. And I just want to recognize Ojore, if you would wave at the crowd. The other artist, of course, cannot be with us today, Judith Vasquez, but you will see her art outside. I think Bonnie will probably refer to it. So I am going to say almost no more. I will just mention that it was striking to me just in the last couple of days, or a couple of weeks at any rate, how much attention suddenly is focused on the question of solitary confinement. And Ojore's art, of course, is about that in large part. New York has made a major change in its policy. 3 or 4 other states are considering modifying or abolishing solitary confinement. I think it's too early to know whether this constitutes a movement and how far it will go, but it's encouraging that there's at least some flexibility in at least some of the states on this question. So I'm going to stop talking and recognize Bonnie and ask her to speak next.
Thank you so much. My early observations of oppression in this country began when I was 12, watching television and seeing children of African descent, my own age, being hosed by police and bitten by dogs for trying to go to school. I spent 10 years in the civil rights movement and then moved north and began working for the American Friends Service Committee, which is the social action arm of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, who have better than a 300-year history of commitment in dealing with human rights issues concerning prisoners. I serve as a human rights advocate on behalf of men, women, and children in U.S. prisons throughout the country, many of whom that I take testimony from call their imprisonment the war at home. In the criminal justice system, the politics of the police, the politics of the courts, the politics of the prison system, and the politics of the death penalty are a manifestation of the racism and classism which governs the lives of all of us. Every part of the U.S. criminal justice system falls most heavily on the poor and people of color, including the fact that slavery is mandated and institutionalized in prisons by the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." While most of us don't give this amendment a second thought, it is at the core of how the labor of slaves was transformed into what people in prison call neo-slavery. The use of prison labor occurs throughout the country and is an integral part of what we've come to know as the prison industrial complex. If you call New Jersey Bureau of Tourism, you are likely talking to a prisoner at Edna Mayhem Correctional Facility for Women who is earning 23 cents an hour. Involuntary forced labor in prisons is everyday real for more than 2 million men and women. African descendant, Latino, and Aboriginal young people tell us that the police feel like an occupation army in their communities. They speak about school systems being used to feed young people of color into youth detention, jails, and prisons, where those bodies are suddenly worth a fortune. People have said to me often that the criminal justice system doesn't work. I've come to believe exactly the opposite, that it works perfectly, just as slavery did, as a matter of economic and political policy. How is it that a 15-year-old in Newark, who the country labels worthless to the economy, who has no hope of getting a job or affording college, can suddenly generate $20,000 to $30,000 a year once in the criminal justice system? The expansion of prisons, parole, probation, the court, and police systems has resulted in an enormous bureaucracy, which has been a boon to everyone from architects to food vendors, all with one thing in common: a paycheck earned by keeping human beings in cages. The criminalization of poverty is a lucrative business, and we have replaced the social safety net with a dragnet. There is no contradiction that prisons are both hugely expensive and very profitable. Just like with military spending, the cost is public and the profits are private. Privatization in the prison industrial complex includes companies which run whole prisons for profit, while at the same time gleaning more profits from forced labor. In the state of New Jersey, food and medical services are provided by corporations with a profit motive. One recent explosion of private industry is the partnering of Corrections Corporation of America with the federal government to detain close to 1 million undocumented people. Using public money to enrich private citizens is the history of capitalism at its most exploitive. I want to share the voice of one young woman who said, "I was 12, so they put me in isolation. I heard children screaming. I saw boys get strung out on meds. They make you take sleeping stuff and needles. They used pepper spray on this girl who was fighting directly in her mouth, and she couldn't breathe. They kept hitting her. We told them that she had asthma, but they wouldn't listen. The United States spends less than any other industrialized nation on nurturing its children. In spite of dismal poverty rates, violent juvenile crime has been declining for years. Yet at least 43 states have passed laws making it easier for children to be tried as adults. We can't escape the similarities with chattel slavery here as well. Not only are these mostly black and brown children taken from their families, they lose any chance of a future of their own choosing. The voices of adult prisoners are haunting as well. I got a letter from a social worker at Utah State Prison who wrote, "John was directed to leave the strip cell and a urine-soaked pillowcase was placed over his head like a hood. He was walked, shackled and hooded to a different cell where he was placed in a device called the chair. He was kept in the chair for over 30 hours, being forced to urinate and defecate on his own hands, which were tied under him." Women who contact the American Friends Service Committee describe conditions of confinement which include enduring sexual abuse by staff, with one woman saying, "That was not part of my sentence to perform oral sex with officers." Some of the most poignant letters I get are from prisoners writing on behalf of the mentally ill who can't write on behalf of themselves, like the man in California who spread feces over his body. The guard's response to this was to put him in a bath so hot it boiled 30% of the skin off of him. These past years have been full of complaints from prisoners and their families, describing inhumane conditions, including cold, filth, callous medical care, extended isolation, often lasting years, use of devices of torture, harassment, brutality, racism. I have received vivid descriptions and drawings of 4- and 5-point restraints, restraint hoods, restraint belts, restraint beds, stun grenades, stun guns, stun belts, spit hoods, tethers, waist and leg chains. Often the worst torment that people testify to is the psychological assault of no-touch torture. This can include humiliation, sleep deprivation, sensory disorientation, extreme light, extreme dark, extreme cold, extreme heat, extended solitary confinement, sometimes lasting decades, confinement including other forms of intentional placement situations. They will take a prisoner who's already in isolation and disappear that prisoner so that nobody knows where they were. Nobody knows what cage they're in. This is a systematic attack on all human stimuli. In the mid-1980s, the AFSC received a letter from Ojiri Lutulo, who had been placed in the Management Control Unit at Trenton State Prison. He asked me what a control unit was, why he was there, and how long he would have to stay. Some of the answers to those questions would unfold over the next quarter of a century that we monitored and advocated on behalf of Ojiri. "How do you describe desperation to someone who is not desperate?" began one letter to me from Ojiri, who went on to depict everyone in the control unit being awakened by guards, dressed in riot gear, holding barking dogs at 1 a.m. every other morning. Once awakened, the prisoners were forced to strip, gather their belongings, while feeling the dogs straining at their leashes, snapping at their private parts. He described being terrorized, intimidated, and the humiliation of being naked, not knowing whether the masked guards were male or female. If we think back to slavery and to the images of the civil rights movement, we know that dogs have been used as a device of torture for hundreds of years in the United States. Ojiri spent 22 years, day after day, week after week, year after year, in the New Jersey State Prison's Management Control Unit without being charged with any infraction. I challenged my intern students to spend 4 hours in their bathroom, and they don't make it. Ojiri not only made it, he managed to create, mentor, and teach through what he called propaganda, which he would send out to me. His social and political commentary on prisons, what was happening to him, and his refusal to be silenced by the horror of his circumstances taught all of us. Ojiri's process of creating collages was to assemble headlines, pictures, and graphics from what few newspapers, magazines, and catalogs he was allowed. Note, scissors were permitted in his cage, so he folded, tore, and glued the pieces of paper that formed the commentary that you see outside. Prolonged solitary confinement in the form of control units, security threat group management units, special needs units, communications management units, and so on, has been a long-time concern for many prison activists on both sides of the walls. Control units surfaced during the 1970s when many in my generation genuinely believed we had the right to dissent politically. It was during these tumultuous years of the civil rights era when large numbers of activists found themselves in U.S. prisons. Sensory deprivation was used with imprisoned members of the Black Panther Party, the Puerto Rican Independentistas, members of the American Indian Movement, members of the Chicano Movement, white anti-imperialists, civil rights activists, and members of the Black Liberation Army. In later years, we found and find jailhouse lawyers, Islamic militants, and prisoner activists placed in extended isolation. Current efforts to expand the solitary confinement population involve the alleged spread of gang problems in the United States. The AFSC began receiving letters from people in street organizations placed in units called Security Threat Group Management Units, complaining of extreme isolation, brutality, and racial profiling. The physical and chemical abuse in gang units is infamous to those of us who monitor the torment that these young people, and some of them are very young, experience daily. The progression of the use of isolation is most recently known as communications management units, which are specifically designed to restrict the communications of imprisoned Muslims with their families, the media, and the outside world. This treatment of Islamic prisoners is replicated in U.S. secret prisons throughout the world, where almost all of those kept in such places are people of color. The transition from slavery to black codes to convict leasing to the Jim Crow laws to the wars on poverty and political activism has been a seamless evolution of political and social incapacitation of the poor and people of color. The sophisticated fascism of the practices of stop and frisk, charging people in inner cities with wandering, driving and walking while black, zip code racism, these and many other de facto practices all serve to keep our prisons full. In a system where over 60% of those who are imprisoned are people of color, where 58% of African youth are sent to adult prisons, where black and brown women are 69% more likely to be imprisoned, the concept of colorblindness doesn't exist. Over 40 years ago, George Jackson noted, "The ultimate expression of law is not order, it's prison." There are hundreds and hundreds of prisons and thousands of laws, and yet there is no social order, no social peace. The law and everything that interlocks with it was constructed for poor, desperate people like me. Ojiri has added, despite years of legislative work, laws have changed nothing for the better. We now have more oppressive laws, more societal surveillance, and more tyrannical prisons. In a system where 95% of prisoners return to our communities, the impact of these practices is felt far beyond prisons. Dealing with these issues of cruelty aren't just a matter of human decency. Serious public health concerns concerning prisoners coming out abound with mental and physical issues, including Hep C, tuberculosis, HIV, mental illness, symptoms related to post-traumatic stress disorder. For more than 25 years, I've counseled people re-entering society from prisons, jails, and youth detention facilities. The prognosis for staying out of prison is poor, with over 60% of people returning. Prisons are often traumatizing places in the lack of feeling, concern, and opportunities for self-improvement. Complex issues of reunification of families at the same time as learning how to build a life make reentry an incredibly difficult period. How do you teach someone to rid themselves of degradation? How long does it take to teach people to feel safe, a sense of empowerment in a world where they often come home emotionally and physically damaged and unemployable? There are many reasons that ex-prisoners do not make it. Paramount among them is they're not supposed to succeed. The conditions and practices that the imprisoned testify to are in violation of the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Convention Against Torture, and the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, all international treaties which the United States has signed. U.S. prison practices also fit the United Nations definition of genocide, with which this country has a long history. If we dig deeper into U.S. criminal justice practices, the political function they serve is inescapable. Police, the courts, the prison system, and the death penalty all serve as social control mechanisms. The economic function they serve is equally as chilling. Just as in the era of chattel slavery, there is a class of people completely dependent on bodies of color as a source of income. The Department of Corrections is more than a set of institutions. It is also a state of mind. That state of mind led to Abu Ghraib, Bagram, Guantanamo, and what is going on in U.S. prisons right at this moment. You cannot give me a reason for the testimonies of the men, women, and children that come into my office and into my life every single day. You cannot give me a reason for what happened to Ojeri. It has been one of the privileges of my life to know both Ojeri and Judy Vasquez, who had the courage to reach outside the prison walls to testify what was happening to them. I've been part of the struggle for civil and human rights for over 45 years. My soul is haunted by what I read in my daily mail. We need to alter the very core of every system that slavery, white supremacy, and poverty has given birth to, especially the criminal justice system. The United States must stop violating the human rights of men, women, and children. We need to decriminalize poverty, mental illness, and in many cases, homosexuality. We need to alter the 13th Amendment and change the racial and economic profiling of arrest and sentencing practices. And we must stop the use of no-touch physical and chemical torture. The American Friends Service Committee has always recognized the existence and continued expansion of the penal system as a profound spiritual crisis, one that allows children to be demonized. It is a crisis which legitimizes torture, isolation, and the abuse of power. It is a crisis that extends beyond prisons into school and judicial systems. I know each time we send a child to bed hungry, that is violence. That wealth concentrated in the hands of a few at the expense of many is violence. And that denial of dignity based on race, class, or sexual preference is violence. And that poverty and prisons are a form of state-manifested violence. Until we recognize that the system's bottom line is social control and creating a business from bodies of color and the poor, there can be no societal healing from what many consider this domestic war. We need to rekindle a national movement against torture and prisons, among people who dare to believe that over 2.5 million men, women, and children need not be imprisoned to make the rest of us feel safe. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking Stan for his very kind invitation and convening this terrific panel. And it's wonderful to be back at Princeton and to see so many friends. So over the last 40 years, as Bonnie was describing so powerfully, we've really passed through a massive experiment in criminal punishment, and long-standing principles of rehabilitation and proportionality in sentencing and individualised treatment were substantially abandoned, and they were replaced by principles of retribution and deterrence and incapacitation. And the main effect of this revolution was the fivefold growth of the scale of prisons and jails in America. And sociologists have called this system mass incarceration. And it represents a new chapter, not just in how we've responded to the problem of crime, but the institutional landscape of American poverty has also been transformed. So let me start by saying something about this idea of mass incarceration. The sociologist David Garland, writing about 10 years ago, coined this term to describe the current state of our prisons and jails. And Garland said mass incarceration really consisted of two things. First, it was a level of incarceration that was markedly above the historical and comparative norm for liberal democratic societies. And second, incarceration was so socially concentrated that we were no longer incarcerating individuals, but we were incarcerating whole social groups. And for me as a sociologist, this idea that we're not incarcerating individuals but incarcerating groups was completely intriguing, and I set about trying to find some empirical markers for this idea. So what does this mean exactly empirically? Well, the United States is the world record holder when it comes to imprisonment. In Western European countries, the incarceration rate's about 100 per 100,000. So 1/10 of 1% of the population in Western Europe is behind bars. And this has been fairly stable for a long time. Incarceration's gone up in some countries, it's gone down in others. But across Western Europe as a whole, it's been fairly stable. So 100 per 100,000 in Western Europe. In the United States, the incarceration rate is over 700 per 100,000. So we're 7 times larger than Europe, and our closest competitors are Russia, Rwanda, Ukraine, and the Republic of Georgia. But our prison populations even exceed those countries on a per capita basis. Now, historically, the US was not so different from the international standard. And for about 5 decades, from 1925, the US imprisonment rate was around 100 per 100,000, just like Western Europe today. And then in the early 1970s, our prisons and jails began to grow, and they grew for the next 35 years. So in terms of numbers, there are now about 2.2 million people who are locked up in prisons or in local jails. And there are another 5 million more under supervision in the community, either on probation or parole. And so that's 7 million people in this country under some kind of correctional supervision. And that's entirely historically new. That's just emerged in the last decade. And as striking as those figures are, that's not what is most important about incarceration in America. The most important thing about incarceration in America today is its unequal distribution across the population. So we know that incarceration is highly concentrated among men. Men are over 90% of prison and jail populations. We know that there's a very large racial disparity, and the average level of schooling of people in prison is only about 10 and a half years. So these disparities of race and class and gender have produced extraordinary levels of incarceration, in particular among young African American men with very low levels of schooling. So among African American men under age 35, if they dropped out of high school, about 35% are right now locked up in local jails or in state or federal prison. Among college-educated white men of the same age, the incarceration rate, we would guess, would be what? So black dropouts, males under 35, their incarceration rate is 35%. White male college-educated men, what would we guess their incarceration rate to be? 1%, 2%? It's 0.3 of 1%. And so the incarceration rate among black dropouts is more than 100 times higher than for college-educated whites. Now, it's natural to say, of course, well, those young African American men who failed at school are also committing a lot more crime. But 30 years ago, when crime rates were much higher than they are today, the incarceration rate for those young men was significantly lower. And so the incarceration rate today is high for one reason and one reason only, and it's because we as a society have chosen the prison as our way of marking the occasion of criminal offending. And this has produced pervasive penal confinement among young black men with little schooling. This is new. It's only emerged in the last decade or so, these pervasive rates of incarceration. We're also learning that this incarceration has a whole variety of negative social and economic effects. Negative effects on economic opportunities, on family life, on the children of incarcerated parents. So incarceration's become highly prevalent among young men in poor communities of colour, and for these communities, incarceration's created very substantial obstacles to participation in all of the mainstream prosperity and opportunities of American life. So the prison in America has become deeply involved in the production of social and economic inequality. Because they're deeply concentrated in a small, disadvantaged fraction of the population, the social and economic effects of incarceration create a discrete social group whose life experience is so distinctive yet unknown that their disadvantage remains largely beyond the apprehension of public policy or public conversation. The redrawing of American social inequality by mass incarceration really amounts to a contraction of citizenship, a contraction of that population that enjoys what T.H. Marshall called full membership of society. What's more, we're now threatened with a very profound gap in legitimacy. The police, the courts, the prisons have significantly lost the confidence of poor and minority communities that they regulate so intensively. Police-community relations are often adversarial, and the institutions that are charged with maintaining order and safety are often viewed with enormous suspicion. So these are all the ingredients, right, of a vicious circle. Exclusion through incarceration further impoverishes poor communities and breeds cynicism about the civic institutions that might bring about change. As a result, the social exclusion that's produced by mass incarceration is very intractable. It's very difficult to change. So the political question is, how do we break this vicious circle? Much of the political significance of incarceration lies in its intimate connection, in my view, with extreme poverty. We've created a massive social distance between the mainstream of American society and very poor communities for whom daily life now involves contact with the criminal justice system. Reversing mass incarceration involves restoring citizenship, reinflating citizenship to those poor, high incarceration communities. So how do we do this? The extension of citizenship is fundamentally, I think, an act of imagination. Outsiders have to be reconceived as insiders. And for this to happen, the insiders of American society have to recognise something of themselves in the citizens to be. And this is ultimately a project of humanisation. So in April 2012, a research team at Harvard began a series of interviews with 135 men and women who were leaving prison, returning to neighbourhoods in Boston. And one of my first interviews was at a minimum security prison with Peter, who was an African-American man in his 40s, and he'd spent most of the last 15 years in prison. Peter had a long history of violence that was episodically associated with drinking and drug use. Throughout his life, he had dealt drugs, stolen cars, hijacked trucks, and got in fights. Over the following year, after his release from prison, we saw in detail many of the challenges confronting those who leave. In the first weeks out, Peter applied to a community program for work clothes, and he got a mass transit card. At first, he divided his time between a friend's place and his older sister's house, a crowded home that also housed her fiancé, her daughter, and her granddaughter. Over months, Peter began to develop a relationship with two of his three kids and their two mothers. He was closer to one mother and her child than another, and he seemed to have focused more attention on his 10-year-old son, though he did what he could to buy both the kids clothes and school supplies. Peter was enrolled in food stamps and Mass Health, which is the Massachusetts Medicaid program. Each month he gave his $200 in food stamps to his sister, though that's now expired and he's hoping to be reinstated. And through Mass Health he's attended mental health and substance abuse treatment, and he's also had a physical and visited the dentist. Now, Peter couldn't find work initially, but he did enrol in employment programs, and he thought it was important to get into a routine. And in these programs, he was doing maintenance and operating machines. The programs paid less than minimum wage. For 6 months in the work program, he'd get up at 5 a.m., he'd be ready to start at 6:30, and he'd work through to 3. Every 2 weeks, he'd report to his probation officer, and at weekends, he'd do community service in lieu of a $65 a month probation fee. Peter gets from place to place by mass transit and walking. He's worried that if he rides in a car with friends, he might get arrested. He's now working regularly at a laundry, 40 hours a week, and he gets $8 an hour at the age of 48. With more interviews and phone calls, we learned a little bit about Peter's history. He grew up in the Lenox Street Projects, which is a public housing complex in Boston's South End. He was a runaway as a kid. He would leave the house for weeks at a time, living with friends, often drinking, using drugs, getting in trouble. And one of his earliest memories of serious violence was when he and his cousin were involved in a midnight brawl between blacks and whites outside an Irish bar in the Boston neighbourhood of Mattapan. In that fight, Peter saw a white man stabbed to death. That was over 30 years ago, and he was 12 years old. At 13, Peter stole a car and he drove it to New York and stayed there for a while. And shortly after that, his father took him to live in Los Angeles, but they returned after about a year, and Peter began to live with his mother. So mass incarceration looks a lot like this, I think. It's not just the burgeoning prison population, but it's how American poverty has come to be lived. The poor do not just live below an income threshold. Low income accompanies the tightly correlated adversity of violence, addiction, mental illness, childhood trauma, school failure, labour market discrimination, housing instability, and family complexity. And on top of all of this, we've overlaid lengthy periods of penal confinement. The future of citizenship for the poor depends a lot on how much the insiders of American society see of themselves in Peter. The totality of his life seems light years away from us. He's struggling for sobriety, housing security, economic independence, and reconciliation with his children. And mass incarceration yields very few degrees of freedom. Arrest and reincarceration are often close at hand. So I think the political question we face is, can we imagine a citizenry that includes Peter as much as it includes the rest of us? I want to try and play a video if I can. We're having trouble with the audio, but... Is this on? This is not coming through at all. Can people hear? A little bit, yes. Can you hear at the back? So in this clip, Peter's telling the story of driving down to New York. His stepson was shot dead, and he's driving his son to New York to buy a suit for the funeral.
Son to New York to get him a suit to go to his brother's funeral. I called, my mother called me because she had found out what happened. And I cried all the way to New York. My son was in the back seat sleeping. I can see that he was going through it mentally. He was going through it mentally. And I cried. I asked my mother, I told my mother, I said, Mom, if I changed my life, would you take care of us? And she was like, who? And I was like, oh, if I change my life, is he going to take care of us? And she was like, yeah. She said, yeah, just trust and believe, he'll take care of you. So I made a decision to change my life. He's taking care of us. Yeah. He's taking care of us.
So I hope you're able to hear that. So this is the question, right? Can we imagine a citizenry that includes Peter as much as it includes the rest of us? So Peter's sold drugs. He's been on both sides of serious violence, and he's been locked up most of his adult life. And for all that, he's getting up at 5 a.m. and he looks for work, or he goes to programs, and he meets his son after school, and he says the street life is behind him. Still, the future's hard to predict for poor men with long criminal histories. Could he once again wave a gun in someone's face, or abandon his children, or relapse to addiction? Sure, of course he could. But a good part of Peter's humanity rests in that possibility too. And I think that's how big our compassion has to be if we're going to find a way out. If we're going to retreat from mass incarceration. Just as we entertain the possibility and hope that people can change, we equally recognise that they can fail, and sometimes spectacularly. Humanity cuts both ways. Let me tell one last story to suggest what I think is all of the possibility that lies before us. I was in Addis Ababa a year ago for a research project in which we're studying justice institutions in Ethiopia. And I was at a dinner with two Ethiopian researchers, and one of them, Mulugeta, told me about a colleague at his research institute, a German anthropologist. Well, one day the anthropologist was out in a remote area, driving through a small village, and his car tragically struck a small child, killing her. The girl's parents ran outside to see what happened, and a crowd quickly formed around the anthropologist. The parents tended to the child. The anthropologist asked that the police be called, but he was told that there weren't any police there. The village dealt with matters like this by itself. Then the anthropologist was told he could go, but they would send for him in a few days. And he returned to Addis. And later that week, a message came for him that he had to return to the village. And he was told that he had to return alone. He went to my friend Mulugeta and asked what he should do. And Mulugeta said, "You have to go back to the village." So he went back. And when he got there, he was escorted to a meeting with the elders of the village. And first he was told to pay 2,500 birr, which is about $125, to the family of the dead child. Next, he was ordered by the meeting to buy a goat for the family. And he purchased the goat, which was then immediately slaughtered. The father of the dead child was then called to the front of the meeting. The anthropologist, already standing at the front of the room, was told to hold out his hand. And so he held out his hand, and his wrist was bound to the wrist of the child's father with the entrails of the goat. And the village elder then announced that the anthropologist was now a member of the dead girl's family. And that was that. He was free to go. The anthropologist returned to Addis, and he was very upset. He felt he hadn't properly compensated the family, nor had he been punished. Mulugeta said, "You have to understand, for the rest of your life, you are now part of that man's family. You have all the obligations of a family member. You have to visit from time to time. If they're going through problems that you might help with, you should help them, just as a member of their own family would." And sometimes our criminal justice system seems so large and so natural and so unchangeable. But it's only been with us in its current form for a few decades. And real alternatives are everywhere, even Ethiopia. So, are we ready for change? Are we capable of this as a society? And maybe we're too fearful, or maybe we're too angry, or too racist. I want to close by giving each of us a challenge. To embark on this project of change, we have to know the darkest corners of our society. It's our civic obligation to know and understand the most severe poverty in this country and abroad. We should know and understand how crime can flourish. We should know and understand the costs of untreated addiction and mental illness and homelessness and food insecurity. And only then, when we understand how life is lived on the margins, can we begin to see something of ourselves in others. And I hope, amidst all of the violence, ultimately find peace and justice. Thanks very much.
I want to thank both of the speakers at two very powerful and moving talks. And now we don't have a lot of time, but I want to open the floor for questions now to address up one or both of them. But I want to ask, by the way, is there a student who has a question? So recognize a student if we have a student question. Otherwise, yes.
I just wanted to, like, a lot of us here are students, are a member of an organization called Students for Prison Education Reform, and like something that we try to think about is how we can, as students, affect change on a scale that's thinkable and doable, but yet not like perceived as too radical or out there, but yet something that like we can come together and find a solution. So when you talk, I guess this is more for Professor Western, when you talk about like coming together and like using these kind of ways of inclusion and understanding our society, how can we as students contribute to this mission in a way that is like doable as a student and perhaps unique as a student, and how can we utilize what we have around us in order to make a difference in creating a criminal justice system that makes more sense for our country?
Yeah, several things, I think. I think this project of humanisation, this is something we can take on at an everyday level in everyday interactions in the ways in which we talk and think about crime, criminal justice, but even more than that, poverty really, which I think is the fundamental issue. And as students, you're uniquely placed to come to know these issues experientially, getting out into the world, both in the context of classes and beyond. I think it's very important that the walls of the institutions become more porous, right? And you can find ways to get into the institution through tutoring or volunteering. I think that's enormously important, and for me that's entirely consistent with this idea of this project of humanisation.
And if I can add to that, how many people are members of your group writing to in the your local juvenile detention facility? Who's in there? Who's in the county jail? You know, that you know. Do you know any of their family members? So it goes right with what Bruce is saying, but I think societal oversight, you have the capacity for oversight as a group, you know, that individuals may not have.
Good. Thank you for that.
As you describe the combination of the awful things in prison and the size of the bureaucracy, I mean, I've always been so pessimistic on bureaucracies being changed and their ability to resist every single force, political and otherwise. I was just an offhanded thought. I was wondering, has there ever been any thought of charter prisons? I mean, I'm just, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, boy, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could close my eyes and dream, and the three of you apply for a charter for a prison. You get allocated the same amount of money per prisoner, and then you find out how much you don't spend the money on the restraints, you spend it on this and that.
I mean, we're already doing that on a large scale.
What's that?
We're doing that on a large scale, aren't we?
That's what
Privatization of prisons.
Well, no, I think private is, it would
Yeah,
seem to
you're
me,
saying something
I think it's very different from a company who wants to earn money, coming in and taking it on as a contract, and the more profit they make from the thing, as opposed to a responsible charter group who has to prove their motives and whatnot to get a charter. And why, how, I mean, just as a governor or whatnot, how can a governor resist except all the pressures on him from the bureaucracies? But here's a sample, what amazing research he'd get done, and think what they would find out, but just a thought.
Very quickly, I think one idea that's usefully generalizable is the idea of accountability. Maybe we need prison accountability in the way that people talk about school accountability. I think prisons are intense institutions, and as Bonnie's presentation made very clear, it's very difficult to do constructive things in that kind of institutional context. And my own view is, given the alternative between doing prison better and doing prison less, we really need to be doing prison less. That's where I would be sort of putting my next policy dollar.
And you can't fix this system. I don't think that you can restore something that has never worked, that has its roots in racism, that has its roots in economics.
It certainly sounds like that bureaucracy will not be fixed, I agree with you. That's why I was thinking, is there a way around it?
I've got two
I
questions.
appreciate the thought.
Two questions here.
I'd like to just follow up some things that the speakers have said. One of the, I want to encourage people who are either already in the prisons tutoring, and other people who are willing to engage with people in prison, to contact the the Princeton and Trenton campaigns to end the new Jim Crow. We are establishing pen pal programs with people from New Jersey State Prison. But there's another idea that I think is really important, and Bonnie alluded to it. One way to have oversight of what's happening in these prisons is to have folks in direct contact with people in prison. But we also need structurally as a way to educate people in our democracy so that they will take action to change the prison system that exists now is to have community-based, independent oversight of the prisons. And that's something that we need to do legislatively. We need to get legislative authority to get people from the community into the prisons. We've talked about how bad the prisons are. I don't know that anyone mentioned that the Vera Institute of Justice calculates that New Jersey spends $1.4 billion a year on our prison system. That's not the criminal courts, that's just the prisons. And nobody except those, a relatively small number of us, have some idea of what goes on in the prison. So, and we've talked about the prisons not being effective in the way that they purport to be. So we have an expensive institution which has detrimental effects on individuals, families, and communities, which is to the detriment of our other public policy objectives, and which is opaque. We need to break through, as you said, break through the walls and get in. And we need to work towards, we need to get the information that we have from our current efforts to break through the walls with legislative authority so that we can go into our prisons. Many states have one form or another of prison oversight, and we need to get something like that in New Jersey. Again, that's something that a number of organizations, including the American Friends Service Committee and the Campaigns to End the New Jim Crow, are working on and will be working on and legislate towards in the near future. By getting oversight, we can move towards people's outrage, which is something that's necessary for change.
Good, thank you.
So, I guess one question I have is, we all know that this is a really complex and big issue, mass incarceration in general. And we also know that in the current political environment, there's a lot of antagonism toward people who really want to see change in this issue and who want to really kind of make reforms. And my question is, given that there are a lot of people with the assumption that, minority people of color, young people of color are in the positions that they're in because of themselves and not because of the structural issues, what are some of the small steps that are possible to gradually move toward a situation where we have a more fair criminal justice system? I mean, there are a lot of options on the table, nationally and at the state level, but from your perspectives, what are the small steps that we can take? Are they drug courts? Are they reducing overcrowding in prisons? What are the small practical things that can be done to kind of get to where we need to go?
Thank you. I am actually feeling as optimistic about the politics of criminal justice reform ever. I think, and I think the public conversation is really poised for transformation. I think public thinking on this is very, very fluid right now. And there was a kind of a debate within the reform community. Can we only talk about the cost and public safety, or can we talk about other things as well? And I think the breakthrough which is capable of yielding very significant change in political talk is whether we can get beyond only a discussion of crime and public safety and only a discussion of cost, to really frankly acknowledge that the system is unjust. And I think we're actually very close to that now. And I think already there are signs from the Attorney General, who's talking in a very critical way about mandatory minimums, and in New York State they're reconsidering or at least talking about solitary confinement. And so things are very fluid now. So I think politically we should be thinking ambitiously. The big changes are things like the reduction in very long sentences, rolling back mandatory minimums, and I think there are real opportunities, particularly for drug offences. And those two things would have a very large effect on reducing populations. And if we were to reduce populations now, we probably need to have a way of retroactively reviewing current sentences, but the federal system has already done that in some cases. So I think we've been through about 10 years of very pragmatic politics on this, and particularly for the students in the room, I would encourage you to think less pragmatically and more about the criminal justice system we'd ideally like to see.
I will balance Bruce's optimism with extreme pessimism. It's very, when I look at the academic community, I feel optimistic. When I look at the legal community, I feel optimistic. There's an enormous disconnect between all of us sitting in this room and the kids I see every single day, or the men and women I see every single day coming into my Newark office. They don't know this intellectual discussion is going on. I said it before, I don't think there's any repairing this system. We have to transform it, and in order to transform it, we have to connect with the victims, we have to connect with the family members. They have to tell us. I've been working since 1975 with family members and people who are in prison and coming out of prison. They direct my work. They direct the work of the American Friends Service Committee. I don't think it could be the other way. I don't think the academic community can make the change, or the legal community for that matter.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
So my question is who? So we talked about incremental reforms, and I just want to know, in your opinion, who are the people that should be targeted in terms of these decisions? I mean, I think we've mentioned that prisoners are forgotten by the mainstream, but the prisoners themselves also don't know who the mainstream is. And I'm speaking from the perspective of growing up, unfortunately visiting family members in prison, being in high school, and I grew up in the Bronx, going to visit friends who were incarcerated, and just kind of looking around in an upstate New York facility and seeing people who I grew up with. Seeing I went to middle school with that guy, that guy went to that high school, and thinking about what's the larger structure here, and who is in control? Like, is it the state commissioners? Is it the legislature? Is it the think tanks? What is their contribution? So that's my question.
I think all of them. They're all in control. The people who are earning money are in control, and I think the economics of it is a huge thing. It's easy for me to say change the system. How then do we retrain officers? Or that huge, middle class that is dependent on this system. So I think as a society, we have some very deep questions to answer. I'm an abolitionist. I want to abolish the system. I understand very clearly, that the fallout from that deserves discussion, because there are people's lives behind the walls, and there are staff lives. I also have a very strong feeling that people inside, prisoners themselves, I was around in the 70s when there was an inside movement, and we're seeing the beginnings of it now. And if I feel any optimism, it's because there are prisoners in Georgia on hunger strike. It's because people in detention facilities, and we haven't even talked about immigration detention facilities, they're on hunger strike. California prisoners are on hunger strike. That's what gives me hope.
Bruce, I think I'm going to answer a slightly different question, Jerry, from the one you posed. But we could ask where is change, significant change, most likely to happen? What would that look like? And in my mind, it's going to be significant sentencing reform, and I think there's already the beginnings of a discussion about that. I tend to think, it's going to be a broad coalition politics. It was a broad coalition that erected the system in the first place. It's going to require a broad coalition to dismantle it. What worries me most is that the criminal justice reform conversation right now is only about criminal justice institutions, and that represents a failure in my mind to acknowledge the really close connection of incarceration with poverty. And it's hard for me to imagine a world with significantly reduced prison and jail populations that isn't providing for the housing needs, the employment needs, the treatment needs of people in the community, and we're not beginning to have that conversation yet. And for me, that's the fundamental one. And of course, the communities who are most deeply affected are indispensable for bringing about change. Not just in criminal justice policy, but now social policy.
Well, this has been an extraordinary afternoon, and I hope everyone will join us for the reception outside. Bonnie will be able to be there. Bruce unfortunately has to go, but can you join me in thanking them?